Hey there, let's jump in and do a quick overview on some of the major themes and concepts within biology. So our first major theme that we're going to cover is, what does it mean to be alive? It seems kind of a silly question. I think most of us in most contexts could say things like, yeah, my car keys are not alive, and this plant right here is alive. In most situations, we have an inherent sense of when something is alive, when something is not. But, like good scientists, we need to be able to define and refine this idea in order to help us study it and frame our questions. So we're going to use a set of guiding questions to help us determine if something is alive or not. First question, does that thing, if we're trying to determine if it's alive or not, does it display order? Living organisms display order on every level, from how the atoms are arranged in order to make very specifically shaped molecules, to how the molecules are arranged in a very specific manner, very specific order to give us organelles, and how organelles are combined to give us cells. All the way up to even how multicellular organisms are made out of tissues, which are multiple different cell types that are arranged in a very specific manner, right? So all living things display order on many different levels. So I like this example of DNA, because in this specific image we can see each of the different atoms that make up DNA. So blue being nitrogen, red being hydrogen, I think gray here is carbon. So if we were to change the arrangement or the order of these atoms in this molecule, it would no longer give us DNA and it would no longer be functional. But we see this at many different levels within living organisms. So atoms are arranged in specific molecules. Smaller molecules are arranged to give us larger macromolecules in very specific orders. Macromolecules are combined together to give us organelles and then cells. And then multiple types of cells can work together to give us tissues. Like here we have a muscle tissue and some connective tissue to give us a muscle. But what's important here that I want to point out is that in each level of organization, we have a new what's called emergent property. So like this muscle right here, that's a combination of connective tissue and muscle tissue, its function would not be possible if it didn't have each of the individual components working together to give it this new function. So because each of these cell types are specialized, connective cell tissues are specialized, the muscle cell tissues are specialized based on their unique molecules that are in there that are arranged in specific ways, that gives it the new property of being a muscle that the individual cells themselves do not possess. One muscle cell cannot do what the entire muscle tissue does together. When we get multiple tissue types working together, we can get what's called an organ or an organ system, right? Like here we have the heart, here we have the connective tissue of the veins and the arteries working with cardiac muscle, working with fat, working with the nervous system to keep the heartbeat going. That gives us, again, a brand new level of function based on the complexity of all of these different parts functioning together. Then organisms are the result of multiple organ systems working together in their unique complexity and functions to give us the entire organism. So again, the emergent property. So I like to think of this also, another example being like a car, right? What part of the car is the car? We have the engine, we have the transmission, we have steering wheel, we have axles and wheels and tires, right? Can you point to any one of those and say, that's the car? No, right? The car is a result of all of those pieces working together in coordination to give us that car, that automobile that we can climb into and go as when we press the gas pedal. That's kind of the idea of emergent properties. This concept of organism is only possible because all of the individual components, organs and organ systems, tissues, cells, molecules, working together to give it its unique properties that are a result of that complex layers. We can go from there. In individual organism, when we have multiple individuals of the same species, we call that a population. Multiple populations living together, we call that a community. So multiple types of species and their populations interacting as a community. And then we zoom out even more and we include the physical components of the environment, and we call that an ecosystem, ending up in the biosphere being all of Earth's surface which contains living organisms, has its own unique properties that function and kind of follow its own unique rules based on the complexity of all those organisms and their physical environment interacting. Second question, does this thing respond to stimuli in its environment? So in order to survive, living things must be able to respond to changes in their environment, both the living and non-living components of their environment, right? Like this plant growing towards light, it's responding to the stimuli in its environment. When we get cold, right, we shiver. That's a response to our environment. Can this thing make more of its own kind? Can it reproduce and make more like itself? Okay, living organisms must be able to reproduce either sexually or asexually, and the whole purpose of reproduction is sending copies of those genes into future generations. Okay, if an organism cannot, or if something cannot reproduce, it's not considered alive. Does its species evolve over time? Living organisms are only still living, species are only still extant if they are acted upon by the process of natural selection, which is one of the mechanisms that results in evolution. That this process, natural selection, ends up in organisms being better suited or better adapted to survive and reproduce and exist in their environment, like the stick bug here, right? This shape and the coloration of the stick bug is a result of natural selection selecting for that specific color, that specific shape. Okay, those that were most successful looked most like sticks and had the most offspring that also looked like sticks. Right, so that's a process of evolution. So just in a nutshell, evolution is the change in species over time, and it's usually the result of natural selection, but there are other forces that can act on a population that causes change over time. The key components to natural selection are these three right here. First and foremost, there must be variation between individuals of a species or of a population. So, meaning not all individuals of a population are genetically identical, right? Like here we have these two wolves, there's variation here. One has genes that give it a black coat, one has genes that give it a white coat. So there's differences between the individuals. Not all of those variations are equal at surviving in a given environment. So in this environment, let's say it's snowy all the time, which one do you think is going to be better at sneaking up on its prey? Probably this one, because it blends in with its environment, right? So maybe this one right here isn't as good at sneaking up on its prey because it's more visible in the snowy environment. So which one's going to get more food? Probably the one that's better at sneaking up on its prey, right? So if you get more food, you're better at surviving, and you're probably better at reproducing too. So whichever variations within that population are best at surviving and reproducing are going to send more copies of their genes into the next generation, right? So let's say we have a whole herd of wolves. Half of them are in white coloration, half of them are this dark coloration. Let's say again, the environment's totally snowy all the time. Those that have this lighter coat coloration are probably going to be better at surviving and reproducing, which means they're going to have more offspring, as opposed to, let's say, only half of the black wolves that were in this population survived. They don't reproduce as many offspring. So we'll see in a few generations there's going to be a higher frequency of these lighter colored wolves than the darker colored wolves. That's evolution. All right, next question determines something is alive. Does it grow and develop over its lifetime? So living organisms follow very specific patterns of growth and development that are guided by their genetic code. So like these kittens here are going to grow and develop into full-fledged cats, and they even look different maybe 3 weeks ago, right? They may not have even had their eyes open 3 weeks ago, right? So that change in growth and development over its lifetime is something that we see in all living organisms. Can this organism, or can this thing perform regulation in order to maintain homeostasis? So this is kind of related to that idea of responding to stimuli in the environment. So what we mean by this, let's kind of break this down a little bit. So homeostasis means a constant environment, usually constant internal environment. We can think of this homeostasis in multiple ways. We can think about it, let's say, like in our blood, right? Our blood has a pretty constant concentration of sodium, has a pretty constant concentration of water, has a pretty constant concentration of proteins in our blood, has a pretty stable pH as well. Okay, that range in which our blood stays within, that's its homeostasis range. If we, for some reason, are out of that range, let's say the pH of our blood rises significantly, we can perform regulation to get it back into homeostasis. Regulation is the process to maintain homeostasis, and the reason why homeostasis is so important and will be a major theme of our class is because life is basically just chemical reactions, and in order for those chemical reactions to occur, we need a very specific environment. It can't be too acidic, can't be too basic, can't be too salty, things like that. Does this thing process energy? That's our next question. So in order to perform regulation, that process is a really energy-heavy process, regulation, as is growth and development and reproduction. All of the things an organism does requires energy. So living organisms need that energy to maintain homeostasis, develop, grow, things like that. This energy comes from transforming energy from one form to another, right? So like this giraffe is eating this plant. It's going to take the stored energy and the chemical bonds of the plant, of the chemical bonds that make up the molecules that make up that plant. It's going to break down those chemical bonds, and it's going to get energy from that. It's basically what we do when we eat. We consume food, we break apart the chemical bonds in that food, and then we convert that stored chemical potential energy into a usable form. Plants use the sun, the energy from the sun to make their energy, right? But they're still transforming energy from one form to another. Whether it's chemical potential energy to another form of chemical potential energy called ATP, or solar energy into chemical energy, we're transforming energy from one form to another.